And welcome to this panel today about the consensus in Brussels towards a post-COVID capitalism for Europe. And we are going to discuss about that with two very distinguished guests. Please join me in welcoming Professor LUCREZIA REICHLIN, that should be connected, and she is, of course, full professor of economics at the London Business School, and Professor Luis Garicano, hello, I can see you both, who is an economist, but since a couple of years is also a politician, as a member of the European Parliament. So you're not here, unfortunately, but we really hope in Trento that you can come next year and be with us. But you cannot know that just 5 minutes ago, it started raining cats and dogs, like pouring down really badly here in Trento. So I think it's perfect for our first question, that is going to be about forecast. So maybe you can hear the thunder, actually, in my microphone. Don't be afraid, it's just the weather outside. So we're going to start asking you about economic forecast when it comes to the Eurozone. And of course, Professor REICHLIN, when it comes to you, I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the Italian one. Recently, the European Commission, of course, published its own spring forecast, and 4.3 was the Eurozone growth. Italy was 4.2. And Professor REICHLIN, you know that recently ISTAT, just a few days ago, said that actually Italy can bounce 2021 of 4.7. So we are going out of this pandemic year with an important rebound. What do you think?
Well, hopefully, right? Because 2020 was really very, very negative. And so it is actually quite normal then the economy would rebound. Remember also that 2020, there was the beginning of a recovery, and then in the fourth quarter, the economy, just went down again because of the health situation. So now the numbers are quite bright and green. So in Italy in particular, but not only. So I think we are in a recovery, and we can argue about the numbers. So it is true that the European projections now, they're probably obsolete because they came out in May, and then in the meantime, some numbers came out on industrial production and confidence indicators. So it is likely that the 2021 number will be much higher than 4.3. Is that forecast 4.7. The Italian government had forecasted 4.5, but again, probably was too pessimistic given the new numbers. And the Italian numbers are on line more or less with the European numbers. If we just adjust to also the European numbers to the new releases. Unfortunately, Italy had a worse recovery a worse recession than average. So in order to recuperate what we have lost, we have to rebound quite a bit more than the rest of Europe. And so the concern is whether the recovery will be long-lasting beyond 2021. And, as anybody who has done forecasting in his life, and I've done quite a bit of it, we know that numbers, as you get further in the future, become more and more uncertain. So I'm quite positive about 2021 and confident about also the ISTAT forecast on 2022. Who knows? Okay, so let's hope that the recovery will continue, but of course there are lots of risks looming. We still don't know whether we'll stabilize from the health point of view, and whether and how bad the scars to the economy have been. This, of course, has implications for the public finances in Italy, and so there is room for concern.
Over the Eurozone, we are seeing, when you look at forecasts, very important rebound for 2021. And considering that most of the member states didn't actually grow in the first trimester, that means that in the second part of the year, we're going to have some states, maybe including Italy, with percentage of growth similar to China one, because if you want to arrive at the end of the year at an average of 4, 4.2, 4.3, that means that at one point of the year, you start to grow around 6, if you wanted to arrive the average. So I would like to ask you if you agree with Professor Reichlin about the fact that there is the risk that anyway this rebound is going to be so strong in 2021, but then slow down in 2022 or not?
Thank you, Giovanna. First of all, thanks to everybody for the invitation. I very much wanted to be there in person, and I am sure we'll arrive next year. We all look forward to starting to be able to do these things in person. And I'm very glad to see all of you there in person. So here, the person who really knows best is Lucrezia. She's been doing this forecasting for a long time, and also this nowcasting, which is particularly useful in such an uncertain moment. My view, I share her optimism. There are 2 or 3 things that are really going better than expected. First, the vaccination is going at full speed. That's really good news. That's the main uncertainty. If we manage to get vaccinated, we get a good summer. If we get a good summer with that Europe has put in place this green card that will allow us to travel all around Europe by showing these vaccinations or the PCRs, we'll have a good summer. And indeed, that is reflected by the PMIs. Just to give you one example, the PMIs were very good, the purchasing manufacturing indexes and the service indexes. Just to give you one example, Spain will have the best growth, has the best PMIs right now in 2 decades since the financial, since the 2006 kind of pre-crisis moment. Now, I do want to emphasize something about the long run, which is what you're pushing me, that I think is really crucial. During the crisis, the divergence between North and South has been accentuated. One of the predominant features of the European economy since 1995 has been that divergence. If you look at the productivity growth in Italy and Spain versus Germany, Austria, or the Netherlands, the difference is gigantic, right? Germany is 15% higher, more productive than it was in 1995. Our countries are 15% less productive than they were then. It's incredible, right? Such a long period of time without any growth. And the crisis seems to have accentuated this divergence. Clearly, the countries around the Mediterranean, the countries whose economies were more intensive in contact, in seeing each other, in being together, bars, etc., those are the countries that have most suffered. And so the question is, to what extent are we going to see a correction of this growing divergence? And that is why this recovery plan, which puts more money in the pockets of Spanish and Italians and Greeks, etc., per capita, and other citizens of Europe, is so important. We really need to now start growing the gap. And it's not just about how much money we invest, but it's also and especially about which reforms we're willing to make. Are we willing to really change our economies and the way our economies work so that this divergence stops? And I am very optimistic about Italy with Draghi. I'm less optimistic about Spain. You have to know that Lucrezia and me have discussed Spain and Italy. She's always been more optimistic about Spain, and I have been more optimistic about Italy. So I might be wrong about this one.
And you also wrote a very interesting proposal during the previous crisis, but we're going to go to that. Before, I wanted to ask you, talking about growth and how the economy in the EU can go forward, looking also not just 2022, but especially 2023, normally we know that in 2023 there is a new factor going back. Not actually a new factor, but a factor coming back. That means the Stability and Growth Pact. So I think it was the opening day of the festival here in Trento, the director, Tito Boeri, interviewed Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, and he said, quite frankly, that he doesn't think that the Stability and Growth Pact could be back as it used to be. Okay, because something has changed. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about that? And how do you think that could evolve this Stability and Growth Pact? Professor Reichlin.
Yeah, well, we have to distinguish about what I think and what is feasible, right? Yeah. So what I think, and I think that many economists think, is that actually the rules are bankrupt in many ways. I mean, they're very complex. They have been disregarded, way before this crisis. And also, during the great financial crisis, they have been procyclical, will mean that they have pushed most countries to consolidate, to consolidate rather than use demand management policy that could complement the action of the central bank. So, I mean, there is, I think, a widespread idea that that rules have to be changed. I mean, even the German Council of Economic Advisors has written that the rules have to be changed. But this discussion is very politically divisive. So I think it's very important that when one thinks, I think that, or I think that, is also mindful of what is the process, what is the democratic legitimacy of this process. And, and to be extremely ambitious and to say, okay, the rules are bad, so let's scrap them and so on, could be actually very dangerous for the construction of a common path towards more integration. Now, if you think of, if you ask me what I think, I think that I have a lot of sympathy for a very radical proposal that has been put forward by two economists, Olivier Blanchard and Jeremy Zettelmeier, a French and a German, and who says, that rules, numerical rules, are likely to be wrong. They may be right maybe for one country, but not for all countries, and they may be right in some historical periods, like think of our 60% debt rule, 3% deficit rule. Maybe it was the right thing to do in the 90s, but today it seems a bit fantastic, right? When the Eurozone is going towards an average of 100% of debt to GDP ratio and, very high fiscal deficit, and also in a period when we have very low interest rate, so that we can refinance the debt at quite cheap conditions. So why having a number, okay? Why shouldn't we have, instead of a number, a standard? So the idea, and ambitious, okay, for example, that we know that that should be sustainable, but it's very difficult to assess what we mean by debt sustainability. So the idea would be to have an aspiration, to have a standard in terms of debt sustainability, but each country could go and tell a fiscal council or the European Commission or some kind of big brother type of institution to say, well, in 5 years, I have this plan to achieve a path, to make sure that I would respect that sustainability. And, and this could be country specific, okay? Because some policy in some countries would make more sense to, for example, to expand through investment. In other countries would make more sense to do other things. So this is a very radical proposal. I don't think it has any chance to go through, but at least it's good to have it there. So because it gives us a benchmark, and at least it warns us about that whatever rules we are going to reformulate, at the end of the story, when you go to enforcement, when you go and judge what are the budgets that country present to the Commission and so on, there is always a lot of judgment. There will always be a lot of judgment. And judgment is good, but if you say there are these very strict rules and then we do whatever we want, then could actually, the danger is that the credibility of the rules go down the drain, and therefore this could be actually counterproductive. So, if I were a benevolent dictator, I would say, let's go for standard rather than rules. But, I am mindful of the fact that this is going to be probably very difficult. And so, let's see where the political process leads us to.
Yeah, it's also true, Professor Garicano, that this crisis, as often happened in the EU after the unique opportunity to move forward certain things like the issuing of common debt that was unthinkable until a few years ago, even during the worst years of the Eurozone crisis, the debt crisis. So I would like to ask you, also from a Brussels perspective, in thinking about potential change in the EU architecture, if the next generation EU should be considered as a point of departure or as a point of arrival. That's mean, member states have done already too much. That's, the maximum that they can do at this point. Or, according to you, is actually the base to build something more? Yeah,
that's a great question. And let me say that two remarks and a straight answer. So, first of all, I agree with what Lucrezia said that we don't want sudden corrections, right? And the way I would put it is, we don't want all the leveraging or the paying back the debt to happen at the same time. If the European countries suddenly want to go into the black hole at the same time, the European Central Bank stops supporting, and the firms and the families start to having to pay their debt, then demand will just collapse. And indeed, the demand management will again be the opposite of what it should be. So we want to have a way to do this in an orderly way. And that does require common instruments, and it requires a better way to manage things together. Now, before answering this question about whether the better way to do things together is to have permanent debt, I want to point out to the people sitting in the room and watching us how extraordinary what Europe did this year is. Indeed, as you very well put it, Giovanna, it was unthinkable for most of us a year ago when I came to Brussels as an MEP, which is exactly 2 years ago, to think that we would have a common debt issue and Eurobonds. Remember all the discussion about Eurobonds 10 years ago? It was a nightmare. Nobody thought it was possible. I thought I would never see that in my life, and we saw it. And Europe has done, think about it, Europe has gotten into really the everyday management and the everyday solution of our problems in our lives, right? Vaccines are Europe. The traveling around Europe this summer is Europe, the green certificate. The recovery plans are Europe and financed by European money. All the Kurzarbeit, the temporary work plans during the people who were on furlough during the pandemic, who stayed at home, were being financed through the shore, through an instrument that Europe issued for this. So Europe has done a lot of supporting the health and the economy of our countries in this period. Now, does this mean that we will have a permanent debt instrument, as you asked? I would say, Giovanna, it is desirable, but we are in the midst of a huge experiment. Europe has said, look, guys, look, Italy, look, Spain, look, US, we are going to do what you want. We're going to borrow the money. You're going to have the money to do a big recovery plan. And now it's our responsibility, particularly in the countries receiving more money, which is Spain and Italy, counting REACT and counting the two budgets, the REACT and the Next Gen, we are basically tied at 82.4 billion. So the two countries that spend more money have a responsibility to spend this money well. We really have to show that this is a good idea. And if we do manage to show it's a good idea, then we will be able to say, look, we think this should be permanent. There are reasons to do this together. And I think that we will manage to have a permanent debt instrument. If we mess up, if there's all sorts of corruption scandals, money is not well spent, the reforms don't happen, you know what I'm talking about, I think, then it will be the last time it happens. So it's a big responsibility, it's a big opportunity, and we should really make sure that this succeeds.
Optimistic, maybe more optimistic than Professor Reichlin. Professor Reichlin, what do you think? The next generation EU can become, if you use it properly this time, can become like a permanent instrument, maybe to finance a common EU budget. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that Europe is going to get there at some point, okay? Or not. So in this, I totally agree with Luis. It really depends on this experiment. This experiment was incredibly bold, and even people like Luis and I, who have been pushing for something like that for many years, we did not believe that something like that would have happened. But it did happen, okay? And, but not everybody is enthusiastic about this experiment, as you know. So not all countries have the same position. Italy and Spain are huge beneficiaries, so there is an element of redistribution in favor of a bunch of countries, and there has to be consensus everywhere for something like that. So clearly, if the money are misspent, if actually Italy doesn't manage to use this money to increase its potential growth, not the growth in 2021, but the average growth in the next 10 years, then it will be problematic, and because the public finances will be stressed, and this will have maybe consequences for other countries, which will feel the pressure to keep on having their purse open for whatever need the countries of the South demand. So I think it's very important that, especially the countries who are big beneficiaries, understand that we need this money not only for us, but we need this money to make sure that we can do more together with the rest of Europe. And, we really need to do more together, because a lot of the problems we are facing are problems that we can only solve, with common tools. For example, climate change. For example, the migration problems. For example, possible future health pandemics. All these problems require, we call them, public European goods. So they are goods that, that they need, support from government, because the private sector is underspending for these kind of goals. But they are European in the sense that they, all the European citizens, get benefits from this expenditure. So it makes a lot of sense to finance them through common tools. Like the US has enormous, spending capacity because they are a real federation. I think that ideally we should get to a position which is similar. But, we don't have a political federation, so that we have to get there through a process. And I think we are indeed at a turning point. So the way in which this money will be spent and, the success of this program will be very significant to understand where Europe is going in the future.
So Professor Reichlin, listening to you, I was thinking maybe you're not an optimist, but you're a dreamer, when you think about an ideal like the US in the EU, and why not? At the end, there's dreams that change the world, so it's important to have this kind of perspective. But I also wanted to, link into this idea of a common EU budget that could be maybe financed by a future next generation EU that are going to stay as an instrument to issuing common debt. But as you may know, even in building a next generation EU, there is already a debate in Brussels about a potential common budget that could be also financed through actually some form of taxation, the cross-border carbon tax, for instance, the plastic tax. And one of the last instruments was considered to be the web tax. So I'm going to Professor Garicano, but then I would like to know also the opinion of Professor Reichlin on that. Just yesterday, the G7 agreed on a new tax for, big corporation of 15%. That was an important achievement. For once, we, as a European, were maybe less ambitious than the Americans. They wanted to do 21%, but anyway, we found a common, ground. And I would like to ask you, Professor Garicano, if you think that this corporate taxation is an important achievement and that could take the place of the digital web tax, whatever you want to call it, in the future.
Yes, the purpose of the digital tax was to push towards this kind of solution. Let me first explain to people why this is so important. Most people are a bit puzzled. They say, 15%? The tax is already higher. So how does this matter? And the reason is that it's not higher. If you are Amazon, if you're Netflix, if you're Google, If you put your intellectual property, which is nothing that anybody can see, an algorithm, if you put it in Ireland or in the Bahamas, and you say that all your sales come from there, you pay zero tax today. So Microsoft, there was a very recent piece of news that Microsoft on several hundred billion euros had paid zero taxes in Ireland. So 15% would be a big improvement. It's 15% worldwide. And it's also related to your sales. So it's not like, oh, I pay my taxes here or there. No, you pay them where you sold. If you sold a lot in Italy, you have to pay a lot in Italy. So this is a huge achievement. It's a drastic improvement, even though the number might sound low to people. They say, well, 15% is not a lot. 15% is a lot more than zero, which is what, in fact, many of these companies are paying. Let me give you an example from Spain. Netflix, in 2018, in Spain, paid 2,000 euros. That means, like, with a revenue of one little building, they will have enough to pay for all the taxes. So it's really extraordinary, right, that we are putting up with this. It's not a level playing field. It's not a fair solution for our citizens. It's actually bad if you're a bookstore and you have to pay your taxes and you compete with Amazon and they pay in Ireland at zero, then you're in trouble, right? Everybody can understand that. So it's a big improvement. Let me just make a broad point about the whole budget. The Parliament and the Council, the government, we have agreed on a set of milestones for new sources of revenue for Europe to pay all these new budgets. So it's not just having the debt, but it's also having ways to pay the debt. And we wanted to have a plastic packaging tax. We want to have a carbon border adjustment tax this year in the books. That's going to happen in theory in June, July. And we want to have a maybe financial transaction tax or a financial contribution tax in 2024. So those are a digital levy, obviously, that, as you said, might not happen. And we want to change in the emission trading scheme, in the way you pay for pollution. So all of these ideas are, let's have digital companies and polluters pay their part and use that money to finance Europe. And I think I'm pretty optimistic that with the new administration, we will manage to have some of these things on the books and on the table.
Professor Reichlin, so what do you think of this agreement of yesterday at the G7 level? Of course, there's going to be also signed at G20 level very soon in Italy, in Venice. And also, I wanted to ask on this behalf, I was saying before that maybe, Europe was a little bit less courageous than US this time, because US wanted the first US proposal was a tax of 21%, actually. So I would like to ask you your take on Biden economy, if you want to call it like that. And do you think that it could be also a push for the European Union on certain way of tackling inequality that we're seeing now in the US with this new administration that maybe were unknown before, at least in the last 4 years?
Well, let me say that I think this agreement on the corporate tax is incredibly, is an incredible success, and as an incredible success in particular of Janet Yellen, the Treasury, the Minister of Finance, if you want, in the US, who has managed to bring home an incredibly successful compromise. And, this has been negotiations which have gone on for years. And so there is, fantastic. Okay, so it's not clear how much money this will really involve, but, just the principle is really big progress. Now, this is a sign also about the U.S. administration and what kind of, strength or purpose they have. Okay, so that, you could say that, they are in a rush because they have 2 years of political space before, the majority in Congress will change. And then, of course, their hands will be tied, like it was the case for the Obama administration. But for sure, nobody was expecting Biden to be so ambitious in what he's trying to achieve. So this has to do with, with the global issues, like, for example, these issues about corporate taxation, but also at the national level, what is doing, it's an experiment that has put all economists, the mainstream economists, the conservative economists like Luis and I'm joking, surprise, okay? So that how come that, we can put all this money on the table and just, distribute money to people directly, or, and then just without without worrying about debt, without worrying about inflation, etc. So is it right or not? Economists who are very kind of Keynesian, so very much pro expenditure, like Larry Summers, for example, has criticized Biden very much because he says he's spending too much. Okay, so that will lead to inflation, and then then we will be back on some nightmares that we had in the 70s. So actually, I think that if you have to ask me, okay, I should say I'm looking at this experiment with an enormous interest. I think that maybe, what Biden is suggesting in doing this is that we should not separate, money that goes for demand and then money that goes for structural productivity, supply side things, that maybe the two things are more related than traditional economists have been thinking about, and that if he's right, okay, so this public expenditure will push up potential output in the US, and if this is the case, we shouldn't be fearing inflation. Now, frankly, economists don't know, okay, so there is a lot that we don't know, okay, so that so this is an experiment. We will find out in a couple of years whether Biden is right or not. But I mean, what he's saying is basically when you don't know, when there is a lot of uncertainty about the effect of what policy is doing, monetary or fiscal, it's better to make mistakes in the direction of doing too much than in making mistakes in the direction of doing too little. After the financial crisis, we did too little. The US did too little, Europe definitely did too little. And now we are doing the opposite. Maybe we're doing too much, maybe we will have some inflation, but it's better to have mistakes in that direction than in the other direction, because the other direction means unemployment, it means poverty, it means disgregation of society at the social and political level, and definitely we can't afford this anymore. So I think I have some sympathy for what he's doing, but I recognize that there are also risks involved.
And for you, Professor Garicano, what do you think, if there is a lesson that we can learn from Biden economy?
I think first, I am very much of the opinion that the first lesson is political, not just economic, right? So one thing we learn is that, there's been all this debate on identity. In Italy, you've had it quite a lot with the emergence of the of populist parties. But in the US, they had it with all of these, and it was consuming the US, right? We've seen it with Trump, all of these debates on the red states versus the blue states, on all the racial issues, all the police issues, all of the issues that were dividing and that were creating huge amount of division. And the first lesson for me is that Biden has turned the debate into a material debate, a traditional left-right debate on how do we raise money and how do we spend it. And to me, there is a, for the people in the audience who are curious, there is a writer in the US, Mark Lilla, a political scientist, who's been complaining that the Democratic Party had lost its way by kind of becoming the party of the people with the gender, with the race, with the this and that, all of these little groups, instead of saying we are the party of America that wants to solve the problems of Americans. And so Biden, in a way, is doing that. He's not getting involved in all the complicated issues of let's do, this or that identity politics. And I think that's very good. He's not saying we're going to be solving these unsolvable problems. He's saying, let's do policies for all the middle classes, spending the money, taxing the people who haven't been taxed in the past, making more social justice in terms of the way taxes are distributed, because we know, for example, people who have a hedge fund in the US don't pay any money on their earnings, which is very crazy because they earn a lot. Something called the carried income tax credit for anybody who wants to find it out. So he says, look, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually solve these material problems. We're going to help people get jobs. We're going to try to help the economy. And I think that's extremely promising. It's extremely promising. We don't have to have Europe involved in all these eternal debates about, immigration and all these complicated things. Can Europe remain or not, identity, all that. We can just solve the problems of the European citizens by doing good budgets, by spending the money when it needs to be spent, by fighting poverty, and by keeping taxes fair. And I think that's really a good lesson that I hope European politicians learn.
And, talking about the political side of that, Professor Reichlin, indeed, it's also true that, Biden and his way of moving also to, tackling inequality, for instance, the taxation that he wants to introduce for the 1% of the country is also fueling a debate among, let's say, the progressive and reformist movement in Europe. Recently, also the Italian secretary of the Democratic Party, Enrico Letta, made a proposal saying that he was inspired also by Biden economy on the possibility of introduce a kind of, taxation on the succession for the highest income in order to redistribute that for the youngest, for the poorest youngest in Italy with a kind of $10,000 payment for each of them. So I would like to ask you, what do you think of this proposal? Because here, in Italy, it was very controversial. The President Draghi said that this is not the moment to take, it's the moment to give to people. And also talking about that, I would like to ask you, do you think that this crisis could be an opportunity at the European level to actually push a little bit away the Eurosceptic movement, or the contrary?
So let's start with the inheritance tax. So I don't think Letta was inspired by Biden. I don't know why he said that, because most countries have inheritance taxes. I mean, I live in the UK, and there is a huge inheritance tax, so that even if there is a conservative government. So Italy is one of the few countries which don't have inheritance taxes. So I think it's, I'm in favor of inheritance taxes, but I don't think that this is going to be a big game change in our taxation system. I think it's the right thing to do. I'm not sure that this is the right moment to go for it. I mean, that's an entirely political issue. And, I leave the politicians to decide, when is a good moment or not. But I mean, there are a lot more important problems in the Italian taxation system and which need reform. But I am in favor of inheritance taxes, but it's not going to solve the problem of poverty. Okay, so let's put it in that way. So Biden is putting a lot of money on the table. Okay, and this is with transfers and other means. So this is it's a different order of magnitude. But also Biden starts from a situation which is much worse than the European situations in terms of inequality, just the state of inequality, but also the trend of the last 20 years in terms of worsening inequality and worsening position of the middle classes. This has happened a little bit everywhere, but not in the same order of magnitude as in the US. So the US has very little, social welfare. So in Europe, we are in a much better state in that respect. So, I mean, Biden in a way is correcting something jurisdiction has its own specificity. So there is something to learn in terms of the macroeconomic impact that these things can have. But in terms of redistribution policies, we are in a very different position, so that we don't need the same policies as the US, I would say. So that's for the first part of your question. The second part of your question is what's going to happen between the populism and pro-European in the future. I don't think so. In a way, I mean, if we look at the Italian situation, our populists have become pro-Europeans, which because they have realized that Europe, it is something that is quite useful, right, in certain circumstances. So that it didn't pay to be anti-European this time. Of course, what they have in mind is a different type of Europe, and what they have in mind, at least the Italian populists, is not so far from what other parties in Northern Europe have in mind. So it's a Europe which has less federalism and more tools at the national level. So, but behind that, maybe there is some skepticism, not only about Europe, but also skepticism about governments. So, one thing is what they say, one thing is what they represent. They definitely represent a discontent, which is there to stay because, now it's true, we are in a recovery. It's true that we have the recovery plan, many things are going the right direction. But, the economy has been scarred very severely. And so that, how we will come out and what kind of social cohesion and so on will be very much, it's still uncertain, okay? And so to the extent in which the recovery is not going to be shared widely in society, I think there will always be argument for parties which, thrive in opposing, governments and, being skeptical about anything which sounds, more establishment. And Europe definitely has always been, the agenda of the establishment, for sure in Italy, but I think also in other countries. So, I mean, to your question, I don't think that the social discontent is going to go. What political forms it will take, we will see. But, I think it's very interesting to see that now all mainstream parties are talking about inclusion and talking about social balance, and so I think the discussion has shifted, and I think it has shifted also thanks to the pressure of the populist parties. So in a way, we have to thank them, because they haven't offered us solutions, but they have alerted us that something really deep and bad was happening.
Thank you, Professor Reichlin. You're talking about, the role of parties and how they can change in the future. What lesson can they learn from, the crisis? Of course, when we think about European integration, it has been made not just by the party and political movement, but sometimes, most of the time, maybe also by the people, of course, single people. And so I would like to ask to Professor Garicano, we are, approaching the end of Merkel era in Europe. In a few months, the German chancellor, she's not going to be there anymore. Someone else is going to take her place. And I would like to ask you, do you think there is someone that also in Europe can take her place?
It's a good question. We are all wondering. We are in a very big transition phase, right? Between September this year and June of the year after, of 22, we're going to see both elections in Germany and France, which are the two leading countries. Merkel is already kind of weakened by that. We see other people in Germany now carrying much more the limelight. And then in France, of course, the expectation is that Macron will continue governing, but it's going to produce some paralysis. During all that period, the clear leader for Europe will be Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi has a huge amount of experience of crisis management. He has a huge knowledge of the European scene. He knows everybody in the central bank, in the Commission, in the Council, and the other governments. And he has a very clear plan of what is needed to do. And that kind of, at the end, knowledge is power, right? Knowing all these people, knowing the problems, understanding the problems is actually a huge part of his ability to lead. Will he turn this ability to lead between now and June of 22 into a longer term ability? That depends on the Italian voters and Italian political system. But I am very happy that that's the case. I think Mario Draghi is already showing that he's extremely viable to Europe also as a prime minister. And he could be the leader of Europe for this recovery phase. That would be great news.
Do you agree, Professor Reichlin?
Well, I think that definitely to have Draghi there is you know, for the European project is great because as Luis says, I mean, he knows what he's talking about. He has a big experience. And you know, and all the, you know, the vision and the networks and so on. I doubt that a big jump in progress of the European Union will be done without France and Germany in a leadership position. This is the history of the European construction. Always tell us that this has been, you know, a Franco-German project, with Italy being, you know, as the third important component. But so I think we really have to keep our eyes open about what's going to happen in Germany and in France. I am much more worried about France than Germany, because I mean, I see that, I mean, it is likely that in Germany, a pro-European party, the Green, will win the election, and maybe, but while France is a much more divided society than Germany is, paradoxically in a way, because, you know, if you look at the, you know, the distinction between the West and the East in Germany, you could think that, you know, Germany were more divided, much less of a unified country, also for historical reasons. But at the end, it is France which has, you know, the most fragmented society and a very aggressive, you know, anti-European opposition. So, you know, I think that we have to be. So Draghi, definitely, Italy has a chance. Italy is back, which is great, because Italy has always been pro-European, and so it's back in the position that should have. But we need France and Germany as well, and Spain, because now Spain actually is not what it used to be. It's a much, you know, much richer and larger countries from an income point of view, and that you know, the legacy of the Spanish history now is, you know, distant past. So that I think Spain is also important.
So before we move to a quick Q&A from the audience, I just have a last question, because you know, Professor Garicano, you were saying that with Professor Reichlin used to fight, who was more pessimistic on the previous crisis. So I would like to ask to both of you, compared to the crisis of 2012, this crisis, I mean, you're more pessimistic or optimistic about it compared to the previous one? Professor Garicano.
I am more optimistic because I think Europe has responded very well. I mean, when you ask about populists, think about February last year, just 15 months ago. Imagine that what we started to see, Germany hoarding equipment, France hoarding equipment, they didn't want to send things to Italy. Italian politicians were really upset, logically, and the Italian people. Imagine that had continued. You remember that President von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, wrote an article in the, I think it was in the Corriere in March, apologizing. So, I mean, things would have been very bad if Europe hadn't come together. But, you know, precisely because things got so bad, Europe really had this wake-up moment, right? We had in March and April, everybody in Brussels was worried. We were just having meetings all the time. Like, we really need to put something together that's really of the size of the crisis. And that was the recovery plan that many of us worked very, very many nights and days over it. And in a way, what it meant is that Europeans now have good reasons to be optimistic, good reasons on the economics, the recovery plan, good reasons on the health, with the vaccines. I think that Europe has done its job, and that's the main difference with the previous crisis. In the previous crisis, Europe almost didn't exist. You know, it was these intergovernmental things with the Eurogroup giving loans to a country to rescue it, asking for lots of conditions. It was really like a group of people asking for a loan package, like the IMF with Argentina, not like a union. And this country, this time, we're working much more like a union.
And for you, Professor Reichlin, do you agree this time is working better than previous one?
Definitely is working better. I mean, we have been, proactive, both for monetary response, fiscal response, the response on also relaxation of the rules, not only the fiscal rules, but also, state aid, bank rules, and so on. So I agree on that. On the other hand, Europe did not have a good crisis if you compare it with the US or with the UK. So we have to think. So I think Europe has been great in comparison with the financial crisis, but it has not been exactly, as great as it could be. Okay, so that because in crisis management, you need flexibility, you need the capacity of decision, so you cannot go with these complicated rules or unanimity, this and that. So we cannot have an architecture which is good only when it's sunny outside. We need to have an architecture which also is operational in crisis management. So, and I think that this is, we will come out with this, from this crisis, with an awareness of that, okay? So that we have done well, but we could have done better, and we could have done more. And so, and we need to, to put the process there, the political process in place so that this debate is as wide as possible with European citizens so that you can actually progress. And because, this is not going to be the last crisis, okay? We're going to have another one for sure. Maybe not next year, but, let's say in 10 years from now, hopefully not earlier. So, we have to prepare for that. And not only, but, we have incredible challenges in front of us. And climate change is one of that, and which will require enormous transformations in the way we live, in the way we organize our cities, in the way, we transform our industries. So for that, we need all the tools. And, we have to start to think what needs to be done, not what can be done within the rules that Europe has given for itself.
Thank you. So maybe this time you're going to fight is going to be more optimistic on the way out. We'll see. We hope so. So thank you to both of you. I would like to... I have a question for you. Se parliamo in italiano, Professor Garicano, do you have a translation? Se parliamo in italiano, can you hear it?
Can you hear us, Professor Garicano? Can you hear the translation?
Very well.
Can you hear it? Okay.
If they want to. Abbiamo tempo per giusto pochi.
So we have some time for questions. This festival has always given a lot of attention to young people, to students. So are there any students here who are willing to make a question? Don't be shy. So first the student and then the lady. Good evening. Well, We have spoken in the past about a greater cooperation and integration of Europe. Do you think that the COVID pandemic is a turning point so that we can get to a point of common defense, or whether the common defense of Europe will remain unsolved? Professor Garicano and then Professor Reichlin.
No, Professor Garicano.
Grazie. I would say there are clearly forces that are pushing us together on the outside, but governments don't want to give up their power. That's very difficult. They only give up their power when faced with a crisis. If things go okay, they will say, well, let's continue like this. And so what you see with the common foreign and security policy is that Europe is very ineffectual in this external stance. If you look at what happened with Putin and with the High Representative of Europe, with Borrell, what happened with Erdogan, remember the Sofagate photos where von der Leyen didn't get a chair. What happened with Lukashenko now, kidnapping a passenger on a European flight. It shows that foreign dictators and strongmen think that they can just push Europe around. I mean, Belarus has 65 billion of GDP. Europe is 250 times bigger. That some country like that can just feel like, okay, I can just kidnap people from them. It's a big embarrassment. And the truth is that our reaction usually is we condemn this very strongly, or we condemn it even more strongly. It's really a bit of an embarrassment. We need to do much, much, much better. And the truth is that there are countries that want to do things, but there are still countries that don't want to share. And we will need some sense of urgency, some sort of crisis to push us together in defense and foreign security policy. I don't think countries are ready to give up their powers.
Defense. Non la sentiamo? Forse può anche risponderci in italiano, professoressa, se vuole.
Mi sentite? Sì? No? Sì. Sì, sono d'accordo con quanto diceva Luis. Io penso che quando si pensa alla difesa si deve pensare per esempio alla storia della moneta, perché sia la moneta che la difesa sono due cose essenziali per la sovranità di una nazione. E rinunciare alla propria moneta, alla capacità di uno Stato appunto di emettere moneta e quindi di finanziare insomma in casi limiti la spesa, il governo, le guerre, whatever, è una rinuncia incredibile. Infatti il punto di arrivo della moneta unica con il trattato di Maastricht è stato un percorso molto molto lungo ed è quasi un miracolo che ci si sia arrivati. E secondo me ci si è arrivati quasi per caso, perché ci si è arrivati insomma anche spinti appunto da eventi eccezionali come sono stati quelli appunto della riunificazione tedesca dell'89. Quindi se si pensa ad un passo di quel tipo di radicalità come appunto quella di avere un esercito comune, e penso che questo ci si arriverà, diciamo, o dati da una necessità esterna oppure alla fine di un percorso che dovrebbe prevedere una maggiore con la M minuscola integrazione politica.
Thank you very much. It was such an interesting conversation. Maybe it was my fault. I was a little bit too long with the questions, so we are actually out of time. But it was very, very, very nice. Thanks to both of you, because in this hour, I think you open our eyes a little bit more, not just about what just happened this year, but what could happen in the future. Thank you very much to both of you, Professor Reichlin, Professor Garicano. And the next year, we wait for you here live, in flesh, in Trento. Okay? Thank you. Bye-bye.